I am Nia, 32 years old, and until last Tuesday, I thought I was simply watching my husband slip away in a hospital bed. His family had just abandoned us, leaving me a pathetic $50 gift card before boarding a first-class flight to Sydney. But the exact second their plane left the tarmac, the man I thought was in an irreversible coma suddenly shot up, ripped out his breathing tube, and grabbed my arm. His first words were not a declaration of love. He looked me dead in the eyes and whispered that we had less than 2 minutes to run, or we would both be murdered. Before I share my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how I dismantled an entire criminal empire using nothing but my laptop and their own arrogance. To understand this betrayal, you have to understand my husband's family. Marcus built a multi-million-dollar tech company. I am a forensic financial auditor, exposing corporate fraud. But to his mother, Vonda, his sister Jasmine, and her white hedge fund manager husband Trent, I was just some girl from South Atlanta who got lucky. They always treated me like the help. The tension erupted when Marcus collapsed during a dinner. His organs failed rapidly. They placed him in a coma and told us to prepare for the worst. I spent 4 agonizing days sleeping in a plastic chair beside his bed. Vonda, Jasmine, and Trent barely visited. When they did, they were busy whispering in the hallway. Then came the morning. Everything shattered. Vonda walked in wearing designer silk, dropping a white envelope on the table. She coldly announced an unavoidable business trip to Sydney. Jasmine impatiently checked her watch while Trent waited in their SUV. Vonda patted my shoulder, told me to stay strong, and they left. The envelope contained a $50 gift card and a sticky note wishing me luck. I sat back down in the uncomfortable plastic chair, feeling a cold wave of isolation wash over me. The intensive care unit was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic mechanical beeping of the heart monitor and the hiss of the ventilator keeping Marcus breathing. I pulled out my phone. I had set up a flight tracking alert for their flight partly out of disbelief that they were leaving. I stared at the screen as the status changed from boarding to departed. The aircraft icon began moving across the digital map, indicating that their flight had successfully taken off. At that exact moment, the heart monitor beside me let out a sharp, continuous warning tone. I jumped up, reaching for the call button to summon the nurses. But before my fingers could graze the plastic device, a hand clamped down on my wrist with terrifying force. I gasped and looked down. Marcus, the man who had been unresponsive and decaying for 4 days, whose skin was pale and covered in wires, suddenly snapped his eyes open. He was not groggy. He was not confused. His eyes were wide with a fierce, burning urgency. With his free hand, he violently tore the oxygen mask off his face, coughing hoarsely as he gasped for real air. He ripped the IV lines from his arms, completely ignoring the blood that began to trickle down his skin. I was completely paralyzed by shock. I tried to push him back down, telling him he needed to rest, but he grabbed my shoulders and pulled me close. His voice was raspy and raw, tearing through his dry throat. He told me to stop talking and listen to him carefully. He said they were coming. He said we had less than 2 minutes to get out of this room, or neither of us would live to see tomorrow. I stared at him, my mind unable to process the absolute impossibility of the situation. I demanded to know what he was talking about. I asked him who was coming. Marcus swung his legs over the edge of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold linoleum floor. He looked at me with a terrifying clarity. He told me his family did not just leave for a business trip. He told me Trent, Jasmine, and his own mother had poisoned him. They needed him dead to take the fall for a massive money laundering operation Trent had been running through Marcus's tech company. They had boarded that plane to escape with $50 million, leaving Marcus to die and take the blame. I felt the blood drain from my face. Everything clicked into place instantly. The sudden illness, the lack of a medical explanation, their frantic whispering, and their hasty departure. It was not a tragic medical mystery. It was a calculated, cold-blooded murder attempt. Marcus grabbed his clothes from the small hospital closet and began dressing with a frantic, desperate energy. He told me Trent had paid off members of a local drug cartel to handle the cleanup. Since Marcus had not died fast enough, Trent had sent them to finish the job and eliminate any witnesses. which meant me. Before I could even formulate a response, a heavy metallic thud echoed from the hallway outside. Marcus froze, pulling me behind the thick privacy curtain. Through the small gap in the fabric, I watched the handle of the heavy wooden door slowly turn. The door swung open, and two tall men stepped into the sterile hospital room. They were wearing standard white doctor coats and surgical masks, but their postures were entirely wrong. They did not look at the medical charts. They did not announce themselves. Instead, they both reached into the deep pockets of their coats and pulled out handguns equipped with long cylindrical silencers. My breath hitched in my throat as I realized the terrifying truth. My husband was right, and the executioners had just arrived to collect their payment. The two men in white coats stepped into the room, suppressed weapons raised. From our hiding spot behind the curtain, I held my breath. Marcus gripped my hand, his skin clammy. The first man approached the empty bed, ripping the blanket back. In that split second of confusion, I knew we had to move. I grabbed a heavy IV pole and shoved it forward with all my strength. It crashed into a tray of glass medical supplies, sending a deafening shatter echoing through the room. Before the men could turn their weapons toward the noise, Marcus and I bolted through the open door and sprinted down the lit corridor. Shouts erupted behind us. We pushed past startled nurses and carts, taking a sharp left toward the imaging wing. I dragged Marcus into the empty imaging suite and locked the heavy door behind us. I looked around frantically for a distraction. My eyes locked onto the emergency quench button on the wall, designed to release helium and trigger alarms. I smashed my fist through the glass covering and pulled the lever. Instantly, high-pitched sirens began blaring throughout the hospital wing, and thick white vapor flooded the corridor outside. We slipped out through a connecting staff door and stumbled down a dark service stairwell, the blaring alarms covering the sound of our footsteps. We ducked into a basement laundry room. The air smelled of industrial bleach. Marcus collapsed against a metal washing machine, clutching his chest and coughing violently. Blood spotted his pale lips. I knelt beside him, begging him to hold on and demanding to know why his mother and sister would want him dead. Marcus leaned his head back, taking a ragged breath. He told me it was all about Trent. Trent was a high-profile hedge fund manager, a man who always looked down on Marcus despite his success. Trent was a white man born into old money who viewed our success as an insult to his pedigree. But Trent had a secret. He gambled away client funds and accumulated massive debts with a violent international drug cartel. To save his own life, Trent promised the cartel he could wash their dirty money. He secretly integrated money laundering algorithms into the payment processing software Marcus designed. I stared at him in absolute horror. I asked him how Vonda and Jasmine were involved. Marcus closed his eyes, a look of profound heartbreak crossing his face. He explained that Trent offered them a cut, $50 million. Vonda was always obsessed with status, and Jasmine wanted a life of luxury she never had to work for. When federal authorities started sniffing around the unusual transactions, Trent panicked. He needed a scapegoat. They needed authorities and the cartel to believe Marcus was the mastermind who stole the money. They could not just shoot him, or it would look like a cartel hit. Marcus coughed again, his breathing growing shallower. He told me they used a slow-acting chemical, a tasteless poison that mimics rapid organ failure. They slipped it into his food during our last family dinner. The doctors were completely baffled. They thought it was a rare autoimmune collapse. The plan was brilliant and ruthless. They would poison Marcus, wait for him to slip into an irreversible coma, and then board a flight to Australia with the stolen $50 million. Once safely overseas, Marcus would die in the hospital, taking the cartel's secrets and the money laundering scheme to his grave. They deliberately framed a dead man. I felt a sickening knot twist in my stomach. The people I had shared holidays with, the people who smiled at our wedding, had coldly executed my husband for money. But Marcus survived the initial dose, and now Trent sent the cartel cleaners to finish the job before we could talk to the police. I pulled Marcus to his feet, throwing his arm over my shoulder. I told him we were going to survive this and make them pay for every single thing they did. We moved through the shadows of the basement, navigating the utility corridors, until we reached the underground parking garage. The harsh fluorescent lights flickered above us. I scanned the rows of vehicles until I spotted my dark blue Tesla parked exactly where I had left it 4 days ago. I helped Marcus shuffle across the cold concrete, my eyes darting around the massive garage for any sign of the men in white coats. We reached the car, and I pulled the door handle. It opened immediately. I pushed Marcus into the passenger seat and rushed around to the driver's side. I slammed the door shut and let out a brief sigh of relief. We were inside. We had a way out. I pressed my foot against the brake pedal and placed my hand on the steering wheel, waiting for the familiar hum of the electric engine coming to life. Instead, the large digital display in the center console suddenly went completely black. A harsh red warning light flashed across the screen. The display lit up with a single terrifying message: ownership transferred. Before I could even process the words, a loud mechanical clunk echoed through the cabin. The heavy locks on all 4 doors engaged simultaneously. I pulled the handle, but it was completely jammed. I pushed the emergency release button, but the system was dead. We were sealed inside a steel cage. The red text on the screen vanished, replaced by a digital timer starting at 60 seconds. The numbers began to tick down. 59, 58. Marcus looked at the screen, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. He told me Trent had remote access to our family accounts. Trent was on the plane hacking the vehicle from 30,000 feet in the air. He had overridden the security protocols, locked us inside, and triggered the battery thermal runaway sequence. The car was going to self-destruct, and we were trapped inside it. The digital timer on the dashboard ticked down. 57. 56. The cabin temperature was rising rapidly as the massive battery pack beneath us initiated its catastrophic thermal runaway sequence. Marcus slammed his weakened fists against the reinforced safety glass, but his desperate blows barely made a sound. Panic threatened to choke me, but I forced it down into a tight, cold knot in my chest. I reached under my driver's seat, my fingers scraping against the textured floorboard until they locked onto cold, heavy steel. I pulled out the solid metal emergency crowbar I always kept hidden for late-night drives through the unpredictable parts of the city. I yelled at Marcus to cover his face and turn away from the window. I gripped the heavy bar with both hands, twisted my torso, and swung with every single ounce of strength I had in my body. The first violent strike sent a thick spider web of deep cracks across the passenger window. The red timer on the screen hit 40 seconds. I swung again, letting out a guttural scream of pure adrenaline and rage. The glass shattered outward in a spectacular explosion of glittering fragments. I kicked the remaining jagged shards away, hoisted my body through the broken window frame, and landed hard on the greasy concrete floor of the parking garage. My knees scraped painfully against the rough surface, but I completely ignored the stinging sensation. I reached back inside the vehicle, grabbed Marcus by the collar of his hospital gown, and hauled him out. His legs buckled the second his bare feet hit the ground, so I threw his heavy arm over my shoulder and dragged him away from the doomed car. We scrambled behind a thick concrete pillar just as the digital timer hit 0. A blinding flash of brilliant white light illuminated the dark garage, followed immediately by a deafening chest-rattling shockwave. The sheer force of the explosion knocked us flat onto the ground as waves of intense, blistering heat washed over our backs. The Tesla was instantly consumed by roaring, toxic chemical flames that licked the ceiling of the garage. Trent really wanted us reduced to nothing but unrecognizable ashes. I pulled Marcus up, his breathing shallow and incredibly erratic from the poison still coursing through his veins. We could not stay here. The thick black smoke would quickly draw the authorities, or worse, the cartel cleaners would return to finish the job. We hurried toward the far end of the underground lot, where the hospital kept its retired transport fleet. My eyes locked onto an older, decommissioned ambulance parked in the deepest shadows. It was a bulky, boxy beast from over a decade ago, which meant it was entirely analog and not connected to any modern digital network that Trent could remotely hack. I smashed the passenger side window with the crowbar, unlocked the heavy door, and shoved Marcus onto the cracked vinyl seat. I climbed into the driver's side, jammed the sharp end of the crowbar directly into the ignition cylinder, and twisted it brutally until the old diesel engine roared to life with a thick cloud of exhaust. I slammed the heavy gear shift into drive and floored the accelerator pedal. The massive ambulance smashed right through the wooden exit barrier of the parking garage and burst out into the warm, humid air of the Atlanta night. I merged recklessly onto the busy Interstate 20, weaving the bulky vehicle through the dense evening traffic with precision. The bright city lights streaked across the cracked windshield, casting shifting, chaotic shadows over Marcus. He slumped heavily against the passenger door, clutching his chest in agony. His voice was a fragile, broken whisper over the loud roar of the diesel engine. He told me it was completely hopeless. He said Trent had full control of the company source code and the master administrative keys. Trent had systematically locked him out of every primary server, every offshore bank account, and every hidden database. The stolen money was already moving rapidly, bouncing through a dozen international shell corporations before it would land safely in Australia. Marcus said we had no money, no resources, and absolutely no way to prove Trent was the mastermind behind the cartel operation. He told me I needed to drop him at a police station and run far away before they hunted me down too. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my hands cramped. A cold, furious calm settled over my entire being. I looked at the dark highway ahead and let out a sharp, bitter laugh. I told Marcus he was absolutely crazy if he thought I was walking away from this. I told him his arrogant family had made a fatal miscalculation. For 5 long years, Vonda and Jasmine treated me like I was just some lucky black girl from the south side of Atlanta who hit the jackpot by marrying into their wealthy circle. Trent treated me like an uneducated charity case at every single family barbecue, talking down to me because I went to a local historically black college instead of his precious Ivy League institution. They saw my quiet, polite demeanor as weakness. They completely forgot who I actually am when the pleasantries end. I glanced over at Marcus, my eyes burning with absolute certainty. I reminded him that I am a senior forensic financial auditor. I do not just balance corporate spreadsheets. I ruthlessly track hidden money across global networks. Trent thought his white privilege made him untouchable. He was about to find out what happens when you underestimate me. I drove us to a secret warehouse I used for off-grid audits. Just as we parked inside the secure facility, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Vonda. She wrote that if Marcus died tonight, I should pack my bags and get out of there. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading Vonda's text message one more time. She actually thought I would cower and run. She thought a simple threat would send me packing back to my old neighborhood with my tail between my legs. For 5 years I had bitten my tongue while she served me backhanded compliments and treated me like a temporary guest in my own marriage. I did not even dignify her absolute delusion with a response. I tossed the phone face down onto the cold metal desk. The time for being the polite, accommodating wife was officially over. I dragged 3 heavy-duty monitors from the storage crates in the corner of the safe house, hauling them onto the desk. Marcus was slumped on a canvas cot nearby, his breathing shallow but blessedly steady. He watched me through half-open eyes as I linked the screens to my encrypted forensic laptop. I powered up the system, and the room was instantly bathed in the cold green light of cascading code. The harsh glow reflected off my face, illuminating the fierce determination I felt burning in my chest. I cracked my knuckles, took a deep breath of the dusty warehouse air, and began the digital war. Getting into the company mainframe was not going to be easy, but Marcus had built the initial architecture. I knew his brilliant coding habits, and more importantly, I knew the hidden forensic backdoors that corporate auditors use to trap high-level embezzlers. Trent had locked the front doors, but he had no idea I held the master key to the basement. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the superficial firewalls Trent had hastily erected before boarding his flight. Once I breached the internal network, the true scale of his devastation became terrifyingly clear. Trent was not just running away with $50 million. He was actively destroying the company's root data from 30,000 feet in the air. I watched the live server logs on my left monitor as terabytes of crucial financial history were being systematically erased. But he was doing much more than deleting. He was replacing the void with meticulously fabricated ledgers. The fake documents were packed with offshore wire transfers, dummy corporations, and unauthorized cartel payouts, all bearing forged digital signatures belonging to Marcus. Trent was building a flawless, airtight case designed to point every single federal investigator directly at a dead man. I immediately launched a counter protocol. Every single time Trent initiated a deletion command from his first-class seat, I deployed a phantom server to catch the data packets before they vanished into the digital abyss. It was a brutal, high-speed tug-of-war played out in lines of code. I was fighting for my husband's legacy-matching wits with an arrogant hedge fund manager who currently held all the administrative keys. Trent quickly noticed the resistance. The command lines on my middle screen spiked with aggressive, chaotic activity as he realized someone was inside the network blocking his purge. He tried to aggressively lock out my terminal, throwing up heavy encryption walls to sever my connection. I slammed the enter key, deploying a massive denial of service loop to flood his primary operating window with junk data. I needed to blind him just long enough to secure the real financial history. For 20 agonizing minutes, we traded heavy digital blows. My hands cramped from the speed of my typing, but I refused to slow down. I managed to isolate the fabricated evidence files he was trying to implant and trapped them in a quarantined server sandbox. I could almost picture the sheer panic setting in on his privileged face, up in that airplane cabin. Trent had always believed he was the smartest person in any room. He was currently learning the hard way that he was severely outmatched by the very woman he loved to belittle. But Trent was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are highly unpredictable. Since he could no longer frame Marcus with the corporate data, he completely shifted his strategy. A loud, piercing alert suddenly echoed from my right monitor, flashing a vibrant, aggressive red across my face. My blood ran cold as I rapidly read the terminal output. Trent had activated a scorched earth financial protocol. He was entirely bypassing the frozen corporate accounts and directly attacking our personal assets. I watched in absolute horror as Marcus's private retirement funds, our shared savings, and every single emergency account we owned were suddenly breached. A massive automated transfer sequence initiated right before my eyes. Trent was systematically siphoning our entire life savings, every dollar Marcus and I had worked for, into a dark web cryptocurrency wallet. A bold digital timer appeared on the top right corner of my screen, counting down with ruthless precision. We had exactly 60 minutes before the crypto transfer became permanently verified on the blockchain. Once that timer hit zero, the money would be completely untraceable and totally irreversible. In exactly 1 hour, Marcus and I would be completely destitute, robbed of our future by the very people who were supposed to be our family. The digital timer on the screen ticked down with merciless precision. 59 minutes, 58 minutes. I watched the numbers flash, representing the complete evaporation of everything Marcus and I had built together. I launched a brute force decryption program to attack the crypto wallet transfer, but the progress bar barely moved. Trent was using a military-grade encryption algorithm. Breaking through it using standard hacking techniques would take days, and I only had a fraction of an hour. The room around me suddenly seemed to stretch and distort, the walls pulling away, while the glowing password prompt pulled me in. The low hum of the computer servers faded into absolute silence. I stared unblinking at the blinking cursor. I realized I could not beat the algorithm. I had to bypass it entirely. I had to hack the man who wrote it. I closed my eyes and forced myself to think like Trent. I needed to crawl inside the mind of an arrogant, privileged hedge fund manager who believed he was untouchable. I remembered the 4th of July barbecue at Vonda's estate last summer. Trent was standing by the expensive outdoor grill, holding an imported craft beer, wearing his signature smug smile. He loudly introduced me to his wealthy colleagues, making a deliberate point to emphasize my educational background. He called my degree a cute little affirmative action piece of paper. He constantly mocked me for choosing to attend a historically black college instead of a real school like his precious Ivy League alma mater. He never missed a chance to deliver a racist microaggression dressed as a joke. Trent is a man who genuinely believes he is intellectually and inherently superior to everyone else in the room, especially a black woman from the south side of Atlanta. His entire identity is tightly wrapped up in that fragile, toxic ego. People like Trent do not use random strings of letters and numbers to secure their most vital secrets. They use passwords that validate their deeply held sense of superiority. They use passwords that make them feel like gods. I opened my eyes and placed my trembling fingers over the illuminated keyboard. I decided to test my theory. I typed the first phrase that came to my mind, based on his endless predictable insults. I typed the letters HBCU dropout, followed by 2 zeros. I hit the enter key. The screen immediately flashed a vibrant, angry red. Access denied. Invalid credential. The timer dropped to 45 minutes. I could hear Marcus groaning softly on the canvas cot behind me, his body still fighting the lingering effects of the lethal poison. I did not have time for multiple failed attempts. The system would permanently lock me out if I triggered the security failsafe. I needed to dig much deeper into Trent's specific brand of arrogance. He does not just look down on my community, he absolutely worships himself. He views himself as the absolute apex of human achievement. I wiped a bead of cold sweat from my forehead. I took a slow, deep breath, centering my focus entirely on the blinking cursor. I let my fingers hover over the keys for a brief second before typing out the next phrase. I typed his name first, Trent. Then I added the exact phrase I heard him drunkenly mutter to his elite friends when he thought no one else was listening. Master Race. Finally, I added the current year. 24. The password field displayed the hidden characters as a string of solid black dots. Trent Master Race 24. My heart slammed against my ribs like a sledgehammer. I pressed the enter key and braced myself for the red failure screen. Instead, the heavy aggressive interface completely shattered. The harsh red warning lights vanished from my monitors, instantly replaced by a brilliant, calming blue glow. A small box appeared in the center of the screen. Master Administrative Access granted. Welcome, Trent. I let out a gasp of pure triumph. I had him. I immediately attacked the cryptocurrency transfer sequence. My fingers flew across the keyboard with renewed vicious energy. I isolated the massive transaction packet in the digital buffer and severed its connection to the dark web node. I intercepted the $50 million transfer just minutes before it could clear the blockchain. I did not just stop the transfer. I aggressively rerouted our entire life savings, along with Marcus's corporate emergency funds, directly back into a secure, heavily encrypted offshore account I had quietly set up years ago under an untraceable alias. The terrifying countdown timer vanished completely from the center monitor. The money was safe. Marcus and I were no longer destitute. I slumped back into the cold metal chair, letting out a massive, shaky breath. I felt like I had been holding in my burning lungs for an absolute eternity. The sheer relief washing over me was indescribable. I looked over my shoulder at my husband, a fierce smile of victory spreading across my face. I had just outsmarted the arrogant man who thought we were nothing but expendable pawns. But my sweet victory was incredibly short-lived. The exact moment the funds settled into my hidden account, the silence of the warehouse was violently shattered. The building's internal security system emitted a loud, ear-piercing shriek that rattled my teeth. Vibrant red strobe lights began spinning aggressively along the high steel ceiling, casting chaotic shadows across the concrete floor. The sudden noise made Marcus jolt awake on the cot, his eyes wide with renewed panic. I snapped my attention back to the middle screen. A massive black warning box dominated the display. By using Trent's master password to hijack the cryptocurrency transfer, I had successfully bypassed his corporate security, but I had inadvertently triggered an active digital tripwire. The drug cartel's elite hacker team had been actively monitoring that specific crypto wallet, waiting for their laundered money to arrive. My unauthorized login had just handed them my exact pinpoint GPS coordinates. The piercing shriek of the perimeter alarm tore through the cavernous warehouse, vibrating deep in my chest. Vibrant red strobe lights began spinning aggressively along the high steel ceiling, casting long, chaotic shadows across the concrete floor. I had just successfully robbed an international drug syndicate of $50 million, and now they had my exact street address. Before I could even attempt to mask our location, the main breaker tripped. Every single light in the facility died instantly. We were plunged into total suffocating pitch black. I grabbed Marcus by his hospital gown and yanked him off the canvas cot. We ducked behind a towering aisle of decommissioned server racks, just as the building shook violently. A deafening metallic screech echoed through the darkness as a heavy armored vehicle smashed directly through the corrugated steel loading door. Concrete dust and jagged metal rained down onto the floor. Heavy combat boots hit the ground in synchronized rhythm. Through the gaps in the server racks, I saw vibrant green laser sights slicing through the dusty air. They were moving methodically, sweeping the aisles. They were heavily armed cartel cleaners, and they were wearing tactical night vision goggles. We were completely unarmed, and Marcus was barely able to stand. I pressed my back against the cold steel of the server rack, pulling Marcus tight against me. My mind raced, processing variables like a high-speed corporate audit. We could not outrun them in the dark, and we certainly could not fight them hand to hand. But I knew this warehouse. I knew the electrical layout intimately because I had personally wired the backup generators for my off-grid server farm. The cartel hitmen had the massive advantage of sight in the darkness, but night vision optics are highly sensitive to sudden extreme bursts of light. I realized I did not need a weapon, I just needed to blind them. I whispered to Marcus to stay low and keep his eyes squeezed completely shut. I dropped to my hands and knees, crawling across the greasy concrete toward the industrial power distribution box at the end of the aisle. My fingers fumbled in the dark, tracing the heavy rubberized casing of the main high-voltage feed. I pulled a small pocket knife from my jacket and began frantically stripping away the thick rubber insulation. I peeled it back to expose the raw braided copper wiring underneath. I could hear the heavy boots advancing down the parallel aisle, drawing closer with every agonizing second. I dragged the exposed copper wire toward a massive liquid-cooled capacitor bank I had salvaged from a gutted supercomputer. The green lasers swept across the floor just inches from my boots. I waited until I heard the tactical radio chatter crackle from the next aisle over. I jammed the live copper wire directly into the exposed primary terminals of the massive capacitor. The result was instantaneous and absolutely catastrophic. A deafening crack of raw electricity ripped through the warehouse. A brilliant, blinding arc of blue and white lightning exploded upward, showering the immediate area in a torrential rain of searing sparks. The localized power surge created a blinding flash of raw energy. Shouts of sheer agony erupted from the cartel hitmen. The intense, unexpected burst of light completely overloaded the sensitive image intensifier tubes in their night vision goggles. It burned their retinas, rendering them completely blind and thoroughly disoriented in the dark. Automatic gunfire erupted wildly as the blinded men panicked, firing randomly into the metal server racks. Sparks and shattered plastic rained over us. I grabbed Marcus by the arm and pulled him through the chaotic crossfire. We scrambled toward the rear maintenance wall, where an oversized industrial ventilation shaft connected to the old city grid. I kicked the rusted latch on the heavy steel grate until it finally snapped. We tumbled headfirst into the narrow metallic ductwork. We crawled on our bellies through the suffocating darkness, the sounds of shouting and blind gunfire slowly fading behind us. We dragged ourselves through the filthy, cramped tunnels for what felt like hours, navigating the endless labyrinth of old municipal pipes. My knees were bruised and bleeding, and the stale, dusty air burned my lungs with every breath. I kept pushing Marcus forward, refusing to let him stop, refusing to let Trent win. We finally reached a vertical access chute that led up to the street level. I braced my shoulders against the damp brick and pushed the heavy iron manhole cover aside. We scrambled out into the humid, muggy air of a dark alleyway, completely surrounded by the comforting sounds of distant city traffic. I leaned against a brick wall, gasping for breath, ready to plan our next move and find a safe place to hide. But before I could speak, Marcus collapsed hard onto the wet pavement. He let out a harsh, agonizing cough, his body convulsing violently. Dark, thick blood splattered onto the wet asphalt. The extreme physical exertion of running and crawling had forced his heart to pump erratically, accelerating the dormant thallium variant back through his bloodstream. His skin turned a terrifying shade of ashen gray, and his breathing became a wet, ragged wheeze. He grabbed my wrist, his grip terrifyingly weak, and gasped that the poison was actively shutting down his internal organs again. We had less than 2 hours before he suffered complete and permanent organ failure. I hauled Marcus up from the cold, wet pavement, throwing his heavy arm over my shoulder. The damp, heavy air of South Atlanta clung to us like a second skin. We moved as fast as his failing body would allow, darting through the labyrinth of narrow, garbage-lined alleyways. Every shadow felt like a threat. Every distant siren made my heart slam violently against my ribs. I practically dragged him down the broken sidewalks, my eyes scanning the cracked brick walls and flickering streetlights. I could not risk taking him to a public hospital. The moment a doctor pulled his blood work, it would trigger a mandatory police report, and Trent had already ensured that any police involvement would paint Marcus as a fugitive cartel money launderer. We were entirely on our own. I needed someone off the grid. I needed someone who owed me, someone who understood the strict code of absolute silence. I steered us toward an abandoned strip mall near the old city rail yard. Hidden behind a rusted security gate was a subterranean clinic run by Dr. Vance. Vance and I went way back to our undergraduate days at our historically black college. He was a prominent member of a major fraternity, and I had once used my forensic accounting skills to quietly erase a massive administrative error that would have gotten him permanently expelled during our senior year. He owed me his entire medical degree, and tonight I was finally calling in that heavy debt for good. I pounded my fist against the heavy steel door, checking my watch. The precious minutes were slipping away. The small viewing panel slid open, revealing Vance's sharp, tired eyes. He took one look at my blood-stained clothes and Marcus's gray, sweating face, and immediately unbolted the heavy deadbolts. He pulled us into the sterile, brightly lit basement clinic, locking the heavy doors behind us. Vance did not ask any unnecessary questions. He grabbed a portable gurney and helped me lay Marcus down under the harsh examination lights. He quickly hooked up a mobile heart monitor and drew a vial of thick, dark blood. The machine beeped erratically, broadcasting the terrifying reality of my husband's rapidly failing heart. Vance ran the blood through a rapid toxicology analyzer in the corner of the cramped room. I paced the floor, my boots leaving small, dusty footprints on the white tiles. The printer hummed, spitting out a narrow strip of diagnostic paper. Vance ripped it off, his jaw tightening. He looked at me with grave, absolute certainty. He said Marcus had been dosed with a highly synthesized thallium variant. It was a designer poison heavily modified to mimic a natural autoimmune collapse while destroying the internal organs at a cellular level. Vance said the extreme physical exertion from our violent escape had forced the toxic compound out of its dormant state and flooded his vital organs. I grabbed Vance by his medical scrubs and demanded to know how to stop it. He told me the internal damage was advancing rapidly. He said there was only one specific chemical compound capable of neutralizing a synthesized thallium variant like this, but it was not something he could just pull from a hospital pharmacy shelf. It was a highly restricted experimental military-grade binder. He knew a black market supplier operating out of a secure private port in Savannah, who could have it couriered to the clinic by a private medical chopper in exactly 45 minutes. But the supplier demanded strict, untraceable payment up front. I asked him how much. Vance looked me dead in the eye and said it would cost exactly $100,000 payable immediately through a secure dark web payment portal. I did not even blink. $100,000 was absolutely nothing compared to my husband's life. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my primary wallet. I pulled out my platinum credit cards and my heavy business expense cards. I handed them to Vance and told him to charge them all, split the transactions, do whatever he had to do to get that chopper in the air right now. Vance swiped the first card into his encrypted terminal. A harsh red light flashed on the screen. Declined. He swiped the second card. Declined. He tried a direct wire transfer from my corporate account. Account frozen. A sickening realization washed over me. Trent had not just emptied our personal savings during the digital war. When I locked him out of the main accounts, he had deployed a secondary financial block reporting all our physical cards and secondary lines of credit as stolen. Trent had systematically cut off my access to the legitimate financial world. I was holding a fistful of useless plastic while my husband was bleeding out on a steel table. Marcus let out an agonizing groan, his body seizing violently as the monitor's alarms grew louder. Vance yelled that we were completely out of time. If he did not initiate the transfer in the next 2 minutes, the supplier would not dispatch the helicopter. I stared at the declined screen, my mind racing through thousands of financial data points I had audited over my career. I refused to let my husband die in a basement because a privileged racist hedge fund manager froze my bank accounts. I pushed Vance away from the terminal and pulled out my forensic laptop. If Trent wanted to play dirty, I was going to rewrite the rules entirely. I quickly brought up a highly secure routing window on my screen. I realized I did not need to use my own money anyway. I was going to use their stolen wealth to fix this nightmare. I finally decided to do something absolutely reckless, completely illegal, and incredibly satisfying right now. I opened a backdoor portal directly into the exclusive banking network of my arrogant, complicit sister-in-law. I was going to hack Jasmine's personal black card to buy the antidote and save my husband's life. I stared at the blinking security prompt on my laptop. Hacking an exclusive bank account usually requires weeks of phishing, but human error is always the weakest link. Jasmine was the definition of human error. She was vain, predictable, and obsessed with her manufactured status. During a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago, she spent 2 hours bragging about the exact date she flew to Paris to purchase her very first Hermès Birkin bag. She called it the day her life began. I knew she used that specific date for everything. I typed the 6 digits into the bypass prompt. November 14th, 2018, 111418. The system paused for a fraction of a second before flashing green. Two-factor authentication successfully bypassed. Welcome, Jasmine. I immediately linked her limitless credit to Vance's encrypted portal. I bypassed standard fraud detection by routing the purchase through a dummy shell corporation posing as an art dealer. I typed in the exact amount required by the black market supplier, $100,000. I hit confirm. The loading bar filled across the screen, checking global routing nodes. A satisfying chime echoed from Vance's terminal. Payment verified and locked. Vance let out a breath and grabbed his radio. He barked confirmation codes to the supplier. He turned to me, his face slick with sweat, and said the helicopter was airborne. We had to keep Marcus breathing for 45 minutes. Those 45 minutes were agonizing. I sat on the floor holding Marcus's hand. The monitor beeped erratically, a terrifying soundtrack to his failing organs. Vance pumped Marcus full of fluids, trying to flush his kidneys and buy us time. I watched my husband's chest rise and fall, each breath rattling heavily. I whispered to him, promising that I was not going to let him leave me here. A sharp knock echoed from the heavy steel door upstairs. Vance grabbed a lockbox and rushed up the stairs. He returned a minute later holding a small titanium cylinder. He popped the seal, pulling out a glass syringe filled with a metallic blue liquid, the military-grade thallium binder. Vance did not hesitate. He found a vein in Marcus's bruised arm and pushed the plunger down, injecting the blue chemical directly into his bloodstream. We stood in absolute silence watching the monitor. For 2 minutes, nothing happened. Then Marcus's body seized violently. His back arched off the steel table, and a horrible gasping sound escaped his lips. I screamed his name, grabbing his shoulders to hold him down. Vance yelled at me to step back, but I refused. As quickly as the seizure started, it stopped. Marcus collapsed back onto the table. I stared at the monitor. The erratic red lines slowly began to smooth out. The harsh alarms faded into a steady beep. The terrifying gray pallor of his skin slowly gave way to a faint warmth. Vance checked his pulse, shining a small penlight into his eyes. Vance let out a loud, triumphant laugh. He looked at me exhausted and said the binder was neutralizing the poison. The cellular destruction had stopped. Marcus was going to survive. I buried my face in Marcus's chest, letting out a sob of pure relief. We had beaten the clock. We had beaten the poison. But our digital war was far from over. 30,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, in the luxurious first-class cabin of a Sydney-bound commercial jet, Jasmine was sipping expensive champagne. She was scrolling mindlessly through the in-flight entertainment system, completely oblivious to the war I was waging on the ground. She was already planning which luxury boutiques she would clear out the moment they landed in Australia. Suddenly, her phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of her tray table. A high-priority banking alert pierced through the quiet hum of the cabin. She picked up the device, annoyed by the interruption. She glanced at the screen and her perfectly manicured face went pale. The notification declared that a $100,000 transaction had just been processed from her private account to an unregistered art dealer. Jasmine let out a piercing scream that startled the flight attendants and woke up the other wealthy passengers. She threw her champagne glass aside, the liquid soaking into the plush carpet. She unbuckled her seatbelt and scrambled out of her pod, hyperventilating. She ran down the aisle toward Trent, who was sitting 2 rows ahead, deep in conversation with Vonda. Jasmine shoved the phone directly into Trent's face, screaming that someone was stealing her money. She shrieked that her accounts were being drained. Trent snatched the phone from her hands, his eyes narrowing as he read the transaction details. He recognized the bypass method immediately. He knew the routing protocols I had used to mask the purchase. The arrogant expression vanished from his face, replaced by a dark mask of absolute fury and sudden realization. He realized that the cartel hitman had failed. He realized the massive cryptocurrency blockade was not just an automated defense mechanism. He realized that I was still alive, I was angry, and I was actively fighting back. Trent shoved Jasmine away, ignoring her crying. He pulled out his encrypted satellite phone and bypassed the airline's communication network. He opened his secure messaging application and typed in my private number. He was no longer trying to hide behind fake corporate commands. This was a direct declaration of war. Down in the basement clinic, as I wiped the sweat from Marcus's forehead, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, staring at the screen. It was a text message from Trent. The text was short, vicious, and dripping with malicious intent. He wrote that the game was over. He said I was just a stupid brat who had played my final card. He promised he was going to make a single phone call and have his friends tear me apart before the sun came up. I stared down at the glowing screen of my phone, reading Trent's vicious threat one more time. He promised to have his cartel friends tear me apart before the sun came up. He actually thought a text message dripping with violent intimidation would make me slam my laptop shut and run for my life. He thought I would cower in the shadows and let him win. He was dead wrong. I did not feel a single ounce of fear. Instead, I felt an overwhelming, icy rush of pure adrenaline flood my veins. I let out a low, dark laugh that echoed off the sterile tile walls of the underground clinic. Marcus was currently resting safely on the steel examination table, his chest rising and falling with strong, steady breaths. The military-grade antidote was actively repairing his damaged cells, flushing the lethal poison from his system. I had already secured our financial future and saved my husband's life. Now it was time to absolutely obliterate Trent. I turned my attention back to my glowing forensic laptop. 30,000 feet in the air, inside the luxurious first-class cabin of a commercial jet flying over the Pacific Ocean. Trent was undoubtedly experiencing a total psychological meltdown. I could almost perfectly picture the heavy beads of cold sweat rolling down his pale, privileged face. He was sitting shoulder to shoulder with Jasmine and Vonda, trapped inside a flying metal tube, completely powerless to stop the digital reckoning I was bringing directly to his doorstep. He had finally realized that I intercepted his initial corporate sabotage. He knew his grand illusion of pinning the money laundering scheme on a dead man was rapidly falling apart. With his primary plan destroyed, Trent abandoned his attack on Marcus's company servers and violently pivoted to his own personal preservation. He desperately needed to sever his direct ties to the cartel before federal investigators could find the digital breadcrumbs. My central monitor immediately lit up with frantic, erratic command prompts. Trent was desperately trying to access his private, highly encrypted offshore server grid. He initiated a massive sequence of hard deletion commands aiming to permanently wipe every single trace of his personal communication logs, shadow bank accounts, and illegal offshore portfolios. He was frantically trying to burn his own digital house to the ground to hide the bodies. I cracked my knuckles and leaned closer to the screen, my eyes tracking his every move. I was not going to let him destroy the evidence of his own guilt. I quickly executed a highly specialized forensic countermeasure known as a feedback loop virus. It is an incredibly aggressive piece of trap code designed specifically to manipulate a panicked target. I successfully hijacked the root directory of his private server and intercepted his internal deletion protocols. Every single time Trent hit the delete key in his comfortable first-class pod, my loop virus seamlessly captured the command. Instead of erasing the targeted file, the virus instantly duplicated the data, encrypted the copy, and fired it directly through a secure tunnel straight to my local hard drive. Then the virus displayed a fake confirmation message on Trent's screen, making him genuinely believe the file was successfully destroyed. He was frantically pressing delete over and over again, furiously trying to clear his tracks, completely unaware that he was not wiping his criminal footprint at all. He was personally handing me every single piece of damning evidence I needed to lock him in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. The sheer speed of the data transfer was staggering. My hard drive was rapidly filling up with his darkest, most closely guarded secrets. I watched the progress bars multiply across my multiple screens. Trent was sweating, panicking, and making incredibly sloppy mistakes. His movements within the system were no longer calculated, precise, or arrogant. They were the desperate thrashing flails of a drowning man gasping for air. He was frantically navigating through deeply buried folders, wildly trying to sanitize his identity before the commercial airliner landed in Sydney. He was moving way too fast, blinded by his own mounting terror. In his absolute desperation to scrub his digital presence from the network, Trent's cursor slipped. He bypassed his standard deletion protocol and accidentally triggered a master compilation command on a heavily encrypted, deeply hidden partition of his private drive. The exact moment he clicked that specific hidden folder, my system alarms went absolutely crazy. A massive, heavily guarded file bypassed my loop virus and began downloading directly onto my desktop. It was not just another mundane folder of bank statements or email logs. The encryption shell surrounding this file was incredibly thick, but I immediately deployed a rapid brute force key to crack the outer layer. The file unzipped, spilling its highly classified contents across my largest monitor. I leaned in closely, my eyes scanning the endless rows of meticulous data. My breath caught completely in my throat. Trent had just handed me the Holy Grail. It was his master ledger. This was not a simple accounting spreadsheet. It was the complete financial Bible for the international drug cartel he worked for. The document contained real names, global coordinates, and exact routing numbers for every cartel boss, shell company, and corrupt government official on their payroll. It detailed every single money laundering schedule Trent had executed over the past 5 years. He kept this ledger hidden as his insurance policy, a bargaining chip against the cartel if they turned on him. In his terrified panic at 30,000 feet, he had dropped it directly into my lap. I sat back in my chair, a chilling, triumphant smile spreading across my face. Trent thought he could threaten my life. He thought he could use his stolen money and arrogance to completely crush me. He had no idea that I now held the ultimate power to dismantle his entire existence and bring a violent criminal syndicate straight to his front door. I leaned closer to the monitor, the harsh green light of the decrypted master ledger reflecting in my eyes. A slow, chilling smile spread across my face. I could feel the raw, untamed power radiating from the screen. Marcus shifted on the cot behind me, his voice still weak but steadying. He asked if I was packaging the files to send to the federal authorities. He assumed I was about to call the FBI and hand them the greatest financial bust of the decade. I did not break my gaze from the monitor. I told him the FBI would take months to build a solid case. Trent would simply hire a team of expensive corporate lawyers, bury the prosecution in endless paperwork, and drag the trial out for years while sitting comfortably in a luxury penthouse on house arrest. I told Marcus that federal justice was way too slow, and it was far too polite for a man who had just tried to murder him in cold blood. I did not want Trent to face a judge. I wanted him to face the very monsters he had climbed into bed with. I reached into the deep pocket of my jacket and pulled out a heavy, thick burner phone. I had stripped it off the tactical vest of the cartel hitman I neutralized back in the dark warehouse. The screen was cracked, but the device was still fully operational. I navigated to the encrypted contact list. There was only one number saved in the entire directory, labeled with a single ominous black star. This was not a local distributor or a low-level street enforcer. This was the direct line to the apex predator. This was the man who owned Trent. I took a deep breath, letting the icy resolve settle into my bones. I pressed the call button and held the cracked plastic to my ear. The line rang twice. A heavy, dead silence followed. Then a voice spoke. It was a deep, gravelly voice that sounded like grinding stones, utterly devoid of any human warmth. The man simply demanded to know why his cleanup team was calling him from an active site. I did not introduce myself. I did not apologize, and I absolutely did not show a single ounce of fear. Instead, I read directly from the glowing master ledger on my screen. I calmly recited a string of highly classified offshore routing numbers. I read aloud the exact balance of a hidden account located in the Cayman Islands, down to the very last cent. I listed the names of 3 corrupt customs officials operating out of the port of Miami, and the exact dates Trent had wired them their latest bribe money. The line went completely dead quiet. I could practically hear the gears turning in the cartel boss's head. I had just effortlessly exposed his most heavily guarded global operations in less than 30 seconds. He demanded to know who I was and how I had obtained those specific operational details. His voice was no longer a calm, gravelly hum. It was a sharp, venomous blade. I kept my tone perfectly even, projecting absolute authority. I told him I was the wife of the man his arrogant hedge fund manager had just tried to assassinate. I told him Trent was not the loyal, brilliant financial wizard the cartel thought he was. I explained that Trent had panicked because federal regulators were starting to flag his sloppy transactions. Trent needed a massive distraction, and he needed a scapegoat to take the fall for his own catastrophic mistakes. I told the boss that Trent poisoned my husband, intending to leave a corpse behind for the feds and the cartel to find, wrapping the entire money laundering operation around a dead man's neck. The boss let out a low, menacing breath. He asked why he should believe a single word coming from a woman who was supposed to be eliminated tonight. I smiled coldly into the phone. I told him he should believe me because his cleanup crew had completely failed. His money was currently missing, and the man who was supposed to be managing his $50 million was currently sipping champagne in a first-class cabin, flying directly to Sydney, Australia. I rattled off Trent's exact flight number, his departure time from Atlanta, and his scheduled arrival time. I told the boss that Trent was planning to vanish into the Australian outback, with the cartel's money leaving everyone else to burn in the fallout. I told him Trent had just spent the last hour frantically trying to delete this very ledger from his private servers to erase his own tracks, completely unaware that I had hijacked his system and downloaded every single file. The silence on the line stretched out heavy and suffocating. The cartel boss was weighing my words against the reality of his missing funds. Trent had promised him a smooth, flawless transition of the $50 million. Instead, the money was blocked. His hitmen were silent, and a stranger was currently reading his financial Bible back to him over a stolen burner phone. Finally, the boss spoke. His voice was a dark, rumbling threat that vibrated through the speaker. He let out a grim, humorless chuckle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He said he did not trust me. He said he did not trust any woman playing games with his organization's lifeblood. He told me that words and flight numbers were cheap, and anybody could hack a server if they were desperate enough. He wanted concrete, absolute proof that Trent was actually making a run for it with the cash. He gave me a terrifying ultimatum. He said I had exactly 2 hours to prove exactly where his $50 million was hiding. He demanded unquestionable verification that Trent was the one holding the purse strings on that flight. He promised to burn Atlanta to the ground. The cartel boss severed the connection, leaving a dead silence echoing in the basement clinic. 2 hours. I had exactly 120 minutes to hand him physical proof that Trent was the rat or my city would burn. Digital files downloaded from a secure cloud server were not going to cut it for a man who ordered executions before breakfast. I needed the physical hard drive. I needed the hardware where Trent stored his offline backups. I knew exactly where that arrogant hedge fund manager kept his most prized possessions. I left Marcus in the capable hands of Dr. Vance, promising my husband I would return before sunrise. I stripped off my blood-stained jacket and swapped it for a tailored black trench coat. I pulled my hair into a severe bun and slid on a pair of dark-rimmed designer glasses. I needed to look like a corporate executive working a late-night merger, not a woman running from a cartel hit squad. I drove straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. The towering skyscrapers of the financial district glittered against the humid night sky. I parked 3 blocks away from Trent's prestigious investment firm and walked the rest of the distance. My heels clicked rhythmically against the pristine concrete pavement. If a camera were following me right now, it would be tracking tight behind my shoulders, capturing the fierce, relentless momentum of my stride as I approached the revolving glass doors of the Class A office building. The lobby was a sprawling monument to corporate greed. Acres of imported Italian marble, towering indoor waterfalls, and brushed steel columns designed to make everyone feel incredibly small. I did not feel small tonight. I walked straight past the massive reception desk with absolute authority. The night security guard barely glanced up from his glowing monitor as I confidently swiped a cloned radio frequency identification badge against the turnstile. The glass gates glided open with a soft chime. I stepped into the gleaming silver elevator and pressed the button for the 42nd floor. As the elevator shot upward in smooth acceleration, the polished mirror doors reflected my fiercely determined face. A bitter memory surfaced perfectly timed to fuel my internal rage. 3 years ago, Vonda had demanded I own an auditing firm during a crucial lunch hour to run a deeply humiliating errand. She forced me to deliver a tray of artisanal lattes directly to Trent in this very building. She told me it was my absolute duty to support the real breadwinner of our family. I remembered walking out of this exact elevator carefully balancing those ridiculous cardboard cups. I remembered walking into Trent's sprawling corner office. He was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, surrounded by elite wealthy colleagues. When I walked in, he did not even bother to look up. He just snapped his fingers, pointed to a cheap coaster on the edge of his desk, and told me not to spill anything on his important documents. He dismissed me with a careless wave of his hand, treating me like a common errand girl. He treated me like I was invisible, absolutely beneath his notice. The elevator chimed, pulling me sharply back to the present. The heavy doors slid open, revealing the dark, silent executive suite of the hedge fund. I stepped out onto the thick carpet. I was no longer the obedient, humiliated girl carrying coffee cups. I was the apex predator stepping directly into the wolf's den, and I was about to completely dismantle his criminal kingdom piece by piece. I walked down the dimly lit corporate corridor, passing rows of empty glass offices, until I reached the heavy double oak doors at the very end of the hall. This was Trent's personal sanctuary. The digital keypad on his door required a complex passcode, but I had bypassed his personal security clearance an hour ago. I tapped in the master override sequence I pulled from his hacked server. The oak doors clicked open. I stepped inside and closed the door firmly behind me. The office was disgustingly lavish, reeking of old money and unearned privilege. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the Atlanta skyline. I did not waste a single second admiring the view. I walked straight to the custom-built bookshelf on the far wall. I knew Trent was a creature of predictable habits. I reached behind a heavy leather-bound encyclopedia of corporate law and pressed the hidden release latch I knew would be there. The entire bookshelf clicked and swung forward on silent hinges, revealing a sleek, reinforced steel wall vault embedded deep into the building's structural concrete. I pulled out my small flashlight and illuminated the safe's digital interface. My confident smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hard knot of sudden tension in my chest. This was not just a standard numeric keypad. Trent had massively upgraded his physical security since the last time I audited a firm like this. The vault was protected by a top-tier military-grade biometric scanner. The glowing interface panel featured 2 distinct, highly advanced security checkpoints. The first was a high-resolution fingerprint scanner. The second was a highly sensitive infrared iris reader positioned perfectly at eye level. A digital warning flashed in stark red letters across the small screen. It clearly stated that the system required simultaneous biological verification to disengage the heavy steel locking bolts. Below the warning, another message spelled out a terrifying, inescapable reality. Any unauthorized access attempt, or any failure to provide perfectly matching biometric data, would instantly trigger a silent alarm protocol. I read the final line of glowing text, and my heart slammed violently against my ribs. If the highly sensitive biometric system registered an incorrect scan, it would automatically dispatch the Atlanta Police Department and completely lock down the entire 42nd floor in exactly 30 seconds. I took a deep, steadying breath and stared directly into the red scanner. The biometric interface pulsed with a crimson glow. A mechanical voice announced that the dual authentication sequence had been initiated. A digital timer appeared above the scanner starting at exactly 30 seconds. If I failed to provide matching biological data before that clock hit zero, the 42nd floor would lock down, trapping me inside a steel cage while police rushed up the elevators. My mind went into hyperdrive, processing my surroundings with razor-sharp clarity. I had no margin for error. I tore my eyes away from the scanner and whipped my head to the right. My gaze locked onto Trent's mahogany liquor cabinet. On top of the polished wood sat a heavy crystal tumbler. It was half filled with amber liquid. Trent had poured himself a celebratory drink before leaving for the airport, leaving the glass abandoned. It was the perfect surface for a clean latent print. The timer dropped to 25 seconds. I lunged across the thick carpet, dropping to my knees in front of the liquor cabinet. I reached into my trench coat pocket and pulled out two things: a small roll of clear medical tape from the underground clinic and my personal compact of dark graphite eyeshadow. I unscrewed the lid and blew a fine dusting of the powder directly onto the smooth crystal glass. I gently blew away the excess dust, revealing a perfectly preserved thumbprint against the transparent surface. Trent was so arrogant he never wiped down his own glass. I ripped a square strip of the medical tape using my teeth. I pressed the sticky side down over the powdered thumbprint, smoothing it out with the edge of my fingernail to remove any trapped air bubbles. I peeled the tape back in one smooth motion. A flawless replica of Trent's biometric signature was now firmly adhered to the plastic strip. The timer beeped aggressively. 15 seconds remaining. I scrambled back across the floor, sliding onto my knees in front of the imposing steel vault. I pressed the medical tape directly against the glowing green fingerprint scanner. The machine hummed, scanning the ridges and valleys of the lifted graphite print. A loud, satisfying chime echoed through the silent office. The fingerprint icon on the screen turned solid green. First biological checkpoint cleared. The timer dropped to 10 seconds. The secondary scanner, a highly sensitive infrared iris reader, projected a narrow beam of red light directly at my face. A synthetic voice demanded immediate ocular verification. I did not panic. I reached into my coat and pulled out my smartphone. I had anticipated this exact security hurdle the moment I realized Trent was upgrading his corporate defenses. During my initial breach of his private server, I scraped his entire personal identity file, including the high-resolution retinal scans he kept stored for his international banking clearances. 5 seconds remaining. I quickly opened a specialized optical manipulation program on my screen. I pulled up the stolen high-definition infrared image of Trent's right eye. I rapidly adjusted the screen brightness, maximizing the contrast to perfectly mimic the organic depth and reflective qualities of a living human cornea. I shoved the glowing phone screen directly into the path of the probing red laser beam, angling it with precision to avoid any digital glare. 3 seconds, 2 seconds. The machine let out a series of rapid clicking noises. The red laser beam vanished instantly. The heavy internal locking bolts of the vault retracted with a loud, echoing thud. The thick steel door popped open just a fraction of an inch, swinging outward on its hinges. I let out a shaky breath, letting my head drop back against the bookshelf. My entire body was trembling from the spike of pure adrenaline. I had beaten his impenetrable military-grade security with a piece of tape, some makeup, and a phone screen. I pushed the heavy steel door open the rest of the way and shined my flashlight into the dark interior of the safe. Sitting perfectly center on the velvet-lined shelf was a thick black external hard drive. This was the physical backup of the cartel ledger. This was the absolute proof I needed to hand over to the FBI and the cartel boss to guarantee Trent would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder in terror. I grabbed the heavy drive and shoved it deep into my coat pocket. As I reached in to grab the power cable, my flashlight beam caught a small flash of color tucked into the back corner of the vault. It was a bright red USB flash drive, small and unassuming. It was deliberately hidden underneath a stack of mundane corporate tax returns. Trent had purposefully separated this specific drive from his main financial backups. My forensic instincts flared immediately. People like Trent only hide things manually when they are terrified of those things ever touching a digital network. I pulled the red drive from the shadows, my curiosity completely overriding my urge to run. I plugged the USB directly into the side port of my laptop. A single unlabeled video file appeared on the screen. I clicked play. The video was grainy shot from a hidden camera, positioned high in the corner of a familiar room. My blood ran completely cold. It was Marcus's intensive care unit. The timestamp matched the exact evening he collapsed. I watched the silent footage as Vonda and Trent stood over my husband's body. Trent reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. He handed it to Vonda. I watched in absolute horror as my mother-in-law, the woman who smiled at our wedding and prayed over our dinner table, coldly unscrewed the cap. She did not hesitate. She poured the lethal chemical directly into Marcus's IV tube. Standing just inside the doorway with her arms crossed was Jasmine. She watched her mother poison her brother to death, and she was smiling. The grainy footage played out on my glowing laptop screen, silent but absolutely deafening in its sheer brutality. I sat completely frozen in the plush leather chair of Trent's executive office. I watched the digital timestamp tick forward on the bottom right corner of the video. I watched my mother-in-law, a woman who led Sunday prayers and baked pies for community bake sales, calmly unscrew the cap of a small glass vial. She did not hesitate. Her hands did not tremble. She did not shed a single tear. Vonda leaned over the sterile hospital bed where her own son lay helpless, hooked up to life support machines. She deliberately tipped the vial and poured the lethal synthesized thallium variant directly into Marcus's intravenous drip. I felt a single scorching hot tear break free and trace a slow path down my cheek. It was a tear born of profound, suffocating agony, grieving the devastating betrayal my husband had endured at the hands of the woman who gave him life. But as I kept my eyes locked on the screen, a dark, heavy shadow eclipsed my sorrow. The camera angle shifted slightly, revealing the hospital room doorway. Jasmine was standing there. My sister-in-law was leaning casually against the doorframe, her arms crossed over her designer jacket. She watched her mother execute her brother in cold blood, and a slow, satisfied smile crept across her face. She was practically giddy at the prospect of inheriting a fortune built on Marcus's corpse. The solitary tear on my cheek was the last one I would ever shed for those monsters. The profound heartbreak inside my chest violently crystallized, hardening into a cold, primal, unyielding rage. The devastating cruelty of my husband's family vastly exceeded my darkest imaginations. They were not just greedy opportunists. They were cold-blooded predators, willing to slaughter their own flesh and blood for a payout. I reached out and ripped the red flash drive from the port. My hands were no longer shaking. My breathing slowed into a steady, predatory rhythm. I grabbed the massive black external hard drive containing the cartel's master ledger and connected it directly to my forensic laptop. I needed to turn this horrific revelation into a highly lethal weapon. I launched a top-tier military-grade encryption protocol. I meticulously packaged the horrific hospital video file alongside the massive cartel financial ledger. I bound them together in a heavily encrypted digital vault, securing the data with a complex cryptographic key that would take a supercomputer a decade to break. I needed to hand this explosive evidence to someone who had the absolute authority to drop a federal hammer on Trent and his accomplices. My mind immediately went to Special Agent David Ross. He was a senior investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing entirely in international financial crimes and massive money laundering syndicates. We had collaborated extensively 3 years ago when I forensic audited a corrupt logistics firm out of Miami. Ross was relentless, utterly incorruptible, and he owed me a massive favor for handing him the key evidence on a silver platter during that specific case. I opened a secure, heavily encrypted email tunnel that bypassed all standard corporate firewalls. I attached the massive digital vault containing the ledger and the video file. I rapidly typed out a concise, undeniable summary of the entire situation. I detailed the cartel involvement, the poisoned money laundering scheme, the attempted murder of my husband, and the exact flight number carrying Trent Vonda and Jasmine toward Sydney. I included the decryption key and hit send. I sat in the dark, silent office watching the progress bar shoot across the screen as the heavy files uploaded to the secure federal server. I glanced at the panoramic window, staring out at the glittering skyline of downtown Atlanta. The city looked incredibly peaceful, completely oblivious to the absolute war I was waging from a stolen office on the 42nd floor. My encrypted burner phone violently vibrated against the polished mahogany desk, shattering the quiet atmosphere. I snatched it up immediately. The caller ID displayed a scrambled sequence of numbers confirming it was a secure federal line. I answered the call and pressed the cold plastic to my ear. Special Agent Ross did not bother with pleasantries. His voice was incredibly tight-laced with a heavy mixture of absolute shock and sharp professional urgency. He told me his entire technical team had just finished ripping through the files I sent. He confirmed that the master ledger was the holy grail they had been chasing for 5 long years. He said the cartel data alone was enough to dismantle 3 major international syndicates. But it was his reaction to the hospital video that told me everything I needed to know. His voice actually shook when he mentioned Vonda pouring the poison. He promised me he would put every single one of them away for multiple consecutive life sentences. I told him I wanted them arrested the exact second their plane touched down on Australian soil. I wanted heavily armed federal authorities waiting for them at the arrival gate. Ross let out a heavy, frustrated sigh that made my stomach drop. He told me to listen to him very carefully. He said the situation was legally incredibly precarious. He explained that Trent Vonda and Jasmine were currently flying over the deep Pacific Ocean. They had officially left United States airspace several hours ago. The FBI possessed zero jurisdiction to storm a commercial airliner in international skies. Ross told me the Australian Federal Police operated under strict independent legal protocols. He said he was immediately forwarding the evidence to his international liaisons in Sydney. However, there was a massive critical loophole protecting Trent. Because the money laundering operation and the poisoning occurred on American soil, the Australian authorities could not arrest them upon landing simply based on an American warrant that had not even been officially processed yet. Ross delivered a devastating, terrifying catch. He stated that the only way to ensure the Australian Federal Police intercepted them at the gate was if they landed while actively committing a major financial crime under Australian jurisdiction. If Trent and Vonda did not have the dirty cartel money sitting actively in their accounts, the exact second the wheels touched the tarmac, the Australian authorities would have absolutely no legal grounds to detain them immediately upon arrival. Special Agent Ross's devastating catch hung heavy in the silent, cold air of the executive suite. Active financial crime under Australian jurisdiction. I ended the secure call and let the heavy burner phone drop onto the polished mahogany desk. I pushed myself up from the leather executive chair and began to pace the length of the massive office. My mind was moving at a blistering, frantic speed, running complex legal calculations and auditing scenarios. The panoramic view of the dark Atlanta skyline seemed to slide past me in a fluid, continuous motion as I walked back and forth, my boots sinking into the plush corporate carpet. I had successfully intercepted the cartel's $50 million an hour ago to protect Marcus and myself from complete financial ruin. But by locking that money safely away in my own encrypted offshore account, I had inadvertently sanitized Trent's arrival in Sydney. If Trent landed in Australia with completely empty pockets, the Australian Federal Police would treat him like any other wealthy American tourist visiting their country. He would casually walk right through customs check into a luxury five-star hotel and completely vanish into the wind before the FBI could ever finalize the massive international extradition paperwork. The local authorities would have absolutely no legal reason to detain him at the arrival gate. I could not let that happen. I absolutely refused to let the man who poisoned my husband simply walk away. I stopped pacing abruptly, my reflection staring back at me in the floor-to-ceiling window. A brilliant, highly dangerous, and entirely illegal strategy crystallized in my mind. If the Australian authorities required Trent to be holding a smoking gun the exact moment his plane touched the tarmac, I was going to hand him a fully loaded, highly radioactive rocket launcher. I walked back to my laptop and cracked my knuckles. I had to do something that went against every single professional instinct I had cultivated as a forensic financial auditor. I had to intentionally execute a massive fraudulent international wire transfer. I accessed my deeply hidden offshore account, where the $50 million was currently resting in secure digital escrow. I initiated a direct high-speed routing protocol targeting Trent's personal highly guarded account at the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. But I was not just going to hand him back the cartel's blood money and hope the authorities noticed. I needed to ensure that the exact second that money hit his Australian portfolio, it would trigger every single national security and anti-terrorism alarm in the Southern Hemisphere. I dove deep into the complex metadata of the transaction packet. I stripped away the clean anonymous routing identifiers I had used to secure the money earlier. I systematically replaced them with highly toxic digital signatures. I specifically embedded tracking nodes and financial markers associated with a notorious global blacklist. It was a primary watch list actively monitored by the Australian Federal Police and their elite anti-terrorism financing division. I effectively weaponized the $50 million. I coded the massive transfer to look like a direct, undeniable, and entirely illegal payout from a heavily sanctioned international narcotics syndicate straight into Trent's personal wealth fund. I hovered my trembling finger over the enter key. Willfully sending $50 million to an arrogant hedge fund manager who just tried to murder my husband felt like pure, unadulterated insanity. It was the ultimate gamble, but it was also the ultimate trap. I pressed the key. The green progress bar flashed across my central screen. The money left my secure vault bounced rapidly through 3 international dummy servers to completely mask my location and slammed directly into Trent's Australian bank account. The trap was officially set, fully armed and actively ticking down to his arrival. High above the dark expanse of the Pacific Ocean, inside the quiet, pressurized cabin of the commercial airliner, Trent was staring obsessively at his glowing phone screen. He had been frantically refreshing his banking application for the last 20 minutes, sweating heavily through his expensive designer shirt. Beside him, Vonda and Jasmine were sleeping comfortably, completely unaware of the digital war that had just raged beneath them. Suddenly, the balance on Trent's screen updated. The $50 million miraculously appeared in his primary checking account. He let out a massive, shuddering sigh of relief, slumping back into his plush leather seat. Because he was incredibly arrogant, and because his entire worldview revolved strictly around his own bottom line, he did not look at the transaction history. He did not check the complex routing data or the attached metadata. He only saw the zeros. He firmly believed he had just outsmarted me. He believed his frantic file deletions had successfully purged his criminal footprint, he had secured his cartel payout, and he had permanently won the war. Drunk on his own toxic ego and completely blinded by his perceived victory, Trent connected his laptop to the expensive in-flight wireless network. He could not just take his stolen money and remain quiet. His fragile pride demanded that he gloat. He had to try and break me one last time. My central monitor chimed loudly with an incoming notification. An email from Trent bypassed my secure spam filter and popped up directly on the screen. I opened it, my eyes narrowing as I read his vicious, arrogant words. He told me to prepare to pick up my husband's cold corpse from the hospital morgue. He casually mentioned that he had already initiated the foreclosure paperwork on my house before he left for the airport, promising that I would be totally homeless and destitute by the end of the week. He signed off the email with a mocking, triumphant farewell, sending his absolute best regards to the grieving widow from 30,000 feet in the air. We stood side by side, bathed in the blue monitor light. A map displayed a digital airplane inching closer to Australia. I stared at Trent's incredibly arrogant email. He thought his foreclosure threat and cruel jokes would cause despair. I felt absolute control as a warm hand rested on my shoulder. Marcus stood right beside me. The antidote had done its job. The gray pallor had vanished from his skin. His breathing was deep and steady. My husband was alive and looking down at the same glowing screen. He leaned close, scanning the vicious words his brother-in-law typed. He let out a low, dark chuckle. He looked at me, a fiercely proud smile forming on his lips. He said Trent always talked too much when he thought he was winning. Marcus nudged me aside and leaned over the keyboard. He wanted to personally deliver the final blow. He told me the dead man gets the last word. I wrapped my arms around his waist as his fingers hovered over the keys. I ignored the foreclosure threat and the insults. He typed a few precise sentences designed to shatter their false sense of security. He typed, "Mom and Trent, enjoy your luxurious first-class seats. I recommend you savor the champagne while you still can. This entire trip was paid for with your freedom. Welcome to Australia." Marcus did not hesitate. He slammed his finger down on the enter key. The screen flashed, confirming the email was sent. We stood in the warehouse watching the airplane cross into Australian airspace. The trap was sprung, and their devastating reality was hurtling toward them. We had done our part. Now we just had to wait for law enforcement to do theirs. High above the dark ocean, the commercial airliner began its descent toward Sydney. The cabin lights illuminated, waking the wealthy passengers in the first-class pods. The captain's voice echoed, announcing they were 30 minutes from touching down. In her seat, Vonda opened her eyes and stretched her arms. She looked incredibly refreshed, wearing a calm, satisfied expression. She glanced at Trent, who was staring at his phone screen. Vonda smiled, thoroughly convinced that their plan had gone off without a flaw. She believed her son was lying dead in an Atlanta hospital room, taking all their dirty cartel secrets straight to his grave. She believed she was about to step off this plane as a wealthy, free woman ready to start a new life. Vonda possessed a cold, calculating mind. She knew that transferring $50 million could sometimes trigger temporary delays. She anticipated Trent might need a few days to navigate the banking regulations before they could access their massive payout. Because she never left anything to chance, she had brought her own personal insurance policy. Vonda reached down and picked up her expensive custom leather handbag. She set it carefully on her lap and unzipped the main compartment. Tucked deep inside a hidden velvet-lined zipper pocket was the Dubois family heirloom. It was a flawless diamond necklace passed down through 3 generations of Marcus's family. It was easily worth over $200,000 on the open market. Vonda had absolutely no sentimental attachment to the piece. To her, it was simply untraceable startup capital. She planned to sell it to a private jeweler the exact second they cleared Australian customs. It was her emergency safety net to keep them living in luxury, while Trent sorted out the cartel funds. Vonda slid her manicured hand into the dark velvet-lined pocket. Her fingers searched for the familiar heavy weight of the diamond setting. She felt nothing but the soft, empty fabric. Her confident smile instantly vanished. She frowned, assuming the necklace had slipped out during the severe turbulence they experienced over Hawaii. She pulled the heavy leather bag closer and began to dig through the contents. She pulled out her passport, her designer sunglasses, and her expensive makeup compacts, tossing them onto the tray table. She ran her hands along the bottom of the bag, her movements growing more desperate. The bag was completely empty. The diamond necklace was entirely gone. A cold, suffocating wave of pure panic crashed over Vonda. Her heart began to slam violently against her ribs. She could not breathe. She tipped the heavy leather bag completely upside down and shook it violently. Nothing fell out. The necklace had not fallen out by accident. It had been deliberately and meticulously removed. Vonda's mind raced back to the chaotic morning they left the house in Atlanta. She remembered leaving her handbag sitting on the kitchen island while she went upstairs to retrieve her travel documents. She remembered seeing me standing in the kitchen when she came back down. I had been standing incredibly close to the island, staring at her with cold, unreadable eyes. I had taken it. Right before they left for the airport, while Vonda was distracted by her own greed and arrogance, I had slipped my hand into her bag and reclaimed my husband's family heirloom. I knew she would try to use it to fund her escape. I made absolutely sure she boarded that plane with nothing but the clothes on her back. Vonda let out a sharp, breathless gasp of sheer terror. She grabbed Trent by the shoulder, her manicured nails digging into his expensive shirt. She shook him violently, her voice cracking as she told him the diamonds were gone. She told him I had stolen her insurance policy. Trent ripped his eyes away from his phone and stared at his mother-in-law, his face draining of color. He looked down at his screen where Marcus's devastating email had just arrived. 30 minutes to landing. The reality of their situation was finally starting to dawn on them. They were trapped in a metal tube flying straight into a heavily guarded international airport, stripped of their safety nets, and holding $50 million of radioactive cartel money. The digital flight tracker on my laptop screen ticked down to the final mile. I shifted my focus from the glowing map to Marcus. He was standing right beside me, his arms crossed over his chest, a deeply satisfied, utterly victorious smile resting on his lips. His dark eyes locked onto the screen, watching the tiny airplane icon finally cross the boundary of the Sydney airport. Down in Australia, it was early morning. The massive commercial airliner pierced through the thick layer of marine clouds, making its final rapid descent toward the runway. Inside the luxurious first-class cabin, the suffocating panic was absolute. Trent sat paralyzed in his plush leather pod. His expensive tailored shirt was completely soaked in cold sweat. He stared out the small oval window as the sprawling Australian coastline rushed up to meet them. He knew he was plummeting directly into a heavily fortified federal trap. Vonda frantically dug through her empty designer handbag one last time, her hands trembling so violently she could barely operate the zipper. Jasmine was openly weeping, her perfect makeup ruined, murmuring that this had to be a mistake. The heavy landing gear deployed with a loud mechanical thud that reverberated through the cabin floor. For Trent, that sound was the definitive slamming of a prison door. The aircraft wheels hit the tarmac with a violent bone-rattling screech. The massive jet engines roared as the thrust reversers engaged, throwing the passengers forward against their seatbelts. The plane slowed its aggressive momentum, smoothly taxiing off the main runway. The exact second, the captain turned off the illuminated seatbelt sign. A synchronized chorus of chimes echoed through the cabin. Trent, Vonda, and Jasmine practically tore their phones from their pockets, their fingers fumbling desperately to deactivate airplane mode. They were hoping against hope that Marcus was just bluffing, that the terrifying email was just a desperate, empty threat from a dying man. The second their devices connected to the local Australian cellular network, the digital avalanche hit them. It was not just one or two alerts. It was an overwhelming, continuous flood of catastrophic notifications. Hundreds of aggressive red banners stacked up on Trent's lock screen in rapid succession, the phone vibrating so intensely it almost slipped from his sweaty grip. He unlocked the device, his eyes darting frantically across the incoming messages. The first alert was an automated high-priority security warning directly from the Commonwealth Bank of Australia. The text was sterile, corporate, and absolutely devastating. It stated that his primary checking account, the exact account holding the $50 million in cartel money, had been immediately and permanently frozen by the Australian Federal Police under suspicion of international terrorism financing. Trent let out a breathless, choked gasp, his chest tightening as if a heavy cinder block had just been dropped on his lungs. The money was locked. The funds were completely untouchable. Before Trent could even process the reality of his frozen assets, his secure messaging application exploded with frantic, terrified texts from his legal team back in Atlanta. His senior defense attorney sent a message entirely in capital letters demanding to know what the hell Trent had done. The lawyer wrote that a heavily armed team of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation had just raided their corporate headquarters. They had smashed through the glass doors, confiscated every single physical hard drive, seized the main servers, and locked down the entire 42nd floor. The lawyer explicitly stated that the FBI possessed a highly classified cartel ledger and a horrific video file of an attempted murder. The final text from his legal counsel was a brutal resignation. The lawyer wrote that Trent was officially a radioactive target, and the firm was completely dropping him as a client to avoid federal prosecution. Trent stared at the glowing screen, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. His entire empire, his flawless reputation, his privileged, untouchable white-collar existence had been thoroughly dismantled and burned to ash in a matter of hours. He looked across the aisle at Vonda. She was reading her own terrifying notifications. Her personal bank accounts, heavily tied to Trent's financial portfolio, were also locked down by international authorities. Her immaculate, carefully curated life of country club dinners and church choir leadership was over. She was officially an accessory to international money laundering and premeditated attempted murder. Jasmine was hyperventilating, clawing at her expensive cashmere sweater as she read a text from her own social circle. The news of the FBI raid had already leaked to the Atlanta press. Her reputation was annihilated. She looked at Trent, her voice rising into a shrill, hysterical scream. She demanded he fix the situation immediately. She yelled that she was not going to a filthy Australian prison. Trent completely ignored his hysterical wife. He slowly looked up toward the front of the cabin. The other wealthy passengers were standing up, stretching their legs, and gathering their carry-on luggage from the overhead compartments, completely oblivious to the absolute destruction occurring in row 2. Trent unbuckled his seatbelt, a wild, desperate urge to run taking over his failing logic. He thought if he could just sprint through the jet bridge and blend into the morning airport crowd, he might find a place to hide. He might find a way to contact the cartel boss and beg for his miserable life. He put his hand on his carry-on bag. Suddenly, the sharp melodic chime of the aircraft public address system cut through the ambient noise of the cabin. Everyone paused. The lead flight attendant's voice crackled over the overhead speakers. Her tone was distinctly flat, tight, and profoundly serious, lacking the usual cheerful customer service warmth. She instructed all the passengers to please return to their seats and immediately fasten their seatbelts. She firmly announced that the Australian Federal Police had heavily secured the entire perimeter of the aircraft, and they were officially requesting permission to board. The harsh voice of the flight attendant echoing through the aircraft cabin was the final nail in their coffin. Trent, Vonda, and Jasmine were trapped inside a metal cylinder surrounded by authorities. Half a world away, inside the dimly lit warehouse in South Atlanta, my smartphone vibrated violently against the metal desk. A FaceTime request flashed brightly, illuminating the dark room. The caller identification displayed Vonda's name. I let the phone vibrate for 3 seconds before swiping the green button to accept the call. I lifted the device, making sure my expression was a mask of absolute calm. I waited. The video feed connected with a burst of static. Vonda's face immediately filled the entire screen. The pristine, elegant matriarch who had spent the last 5 years terrorizing me was completely gone. Her expensive hair was a chaotic, tangled mess. Her heavy designer makeup was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks, ruined by terrified tears. The background behind her was a blur of sheer panic. I could clearly see the luxurious first-class cabin behind her shoulder, but the atmosphere was pure bedlam. Heavily armed officers wearing tactical vests were moving down the narrow aisle, blocking every single exit. Vonda did not even bother to hide her malicious nature. She stared directly into the front-facing camera of her phone, her eyes wide with a manic rage. She practically spat her words into the microphone, her voice a shrill screech that distorted the audio on my end. She demanded to know what I had done to Trent's bank accounts. She screamed that armed police officers were currently barricading the door of the airplane. She ordered me to fix the digital glitch, immediately threatening to have me completely destroyed if I did not release the frozen funds right that second. Unbelievable. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not offer her a single ounce of the submissive, polite daughter-in-law routine she had forced me to perform for 5 long years. Instead, I slowly reached for the ceramic mug resting beside my keyboard. I lifted the mug to my lips and took a deliberate sip of hot black coffee. I let the silence stretch across the international connection, forcing her to stew in her own mounting terror. I lowered the mug and stared dead into the camera lens, letting a razor-sharp smile form now. I smiled. I spoke with chilling clarity, ensuring every syllable cut through the frantic background noise of her impending arrest. I told my mother-in-law that she was giving me way too much credit. I explained that I was not a magician capable of locking down an international airport. I told her that the armed officers currently marching down the aisle toward her first-class seat were not responding to a simple banking error. I informed her that the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working alongside Interpol and the Australian authorities, were the ones currently dismantling her entire life. They have seized all. Nothing remained. The horrific realization hit Vonda like a physical blow to the chest. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Through the screen, I watched Jasmine hyperventilating in the background, clawing at her own face in sheer terror. I could hear Trent's muffled, frantic shouts as he desperately tried to argue with the approaching federal officers, invoking his wealth and status as if it could somehow shield him from a money laundering indictment. Vonda desperately tried to pivot her strategy. She frantically tried to blame Trent entirely, claiming she had absolutely no idea what Trent was doing with the money. I brutally shut down her pathetic, transparent lies before she could even finish her sentence. I casually mentioned the hidden red flash drive I had pulled from Trent's secret corporate vault. I told Vonda that I possessed the hidden security camera footage from the hospital room. I described in vivid detail how I watched her calmly unscrew the cap of a small glass vial. I told her I watched her pour the synthesized poison directly into her own son's drip, while Jasmine stood in the doorway and smiled. I dismantled every lie Vonda tried to weave today, right now. Silence. Realizing she could not lie or manipulate her way out of the video evidence, Vonda resorted to pure, unadulterated malice. The last remaining shreds of her fake pious persona violently burned away, leaving nothing but a ruthless, cornered predator. She glared into the camera, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of pure hatred. She prepared to curse me out, screaming that Marcus was already dead, and I would be the very next person in the grave. She took a deep, ragged breath, preparing to unleash a horrific torrent of verbal abuse, to break my spirit one last time today. Before Vonda could utter a single venomous syllable, a tall, broad shadow gracefully fell across my glowing phone screen. Marcus stepped smoothly into the tight video frame. He was not wearing a fragile hospital gown. He was not pale, and he was certainly not dying. He was wearing a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit. He looked incredibly strong, deeply resolute, and perfectly healthy. He stepped up to the desk and stood shoulder to shoulder with me, wrapping his arm protectively around my waist. He leaned down, placing his face next to mine, staring directly into the camera with absolute authority. The ultimate reaction on the other side of the screen was absolutely priceless. Vonda's jaw dropped open so wide it looked painful. Her eyes bulged from her skull in sheer, unadulterated horror. Jasmine abruptly stopped her hysterical crying and stared at the screen in absolute petrified silence. The loud, chaotic noise of the airplane cabin seemed to completely vanish, replaced by the deafening silence of their total catastrophic failure. They looked exactly like they had just seen a ghost returning from the grave. The undeniable living proof of their absolute destruction was staring right back at them, shattering their delusion. Marcus did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of his physical presence was enough to suck all the remaining oxygen directly out of the first-class cabin. He leaned closer to the phone microphone, his dark eyes locked intensely onto the terrified face of his own mother. He offered her a cold, razor-sharp smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. He told her she completely missed the mark. He stated that pouring a lethal synthesized chemical into her own son's intravenous drip was a remarkably bold financial strategy, but she had severely underestimated his will to survive. He spoke with a chilling, deliberate cadence, ensuring every single word acted like a physical blow. He informed Vonda that he was not just alive and fully recovered. He was currently standing in a secure facility alongside his brilliant wife, actively watching the final moments of her freedom evaporate. Marcus delivered the ultimate devastating kill shot. He calmly explained that Nia had successfully breached Trent's heavily guarded corporate vault in downtown Atlanta. He told his mother they had recovered the hidden red flash drive containing the secret security camera footage from the hospital room. He described the exact video file, mentioning the way she casually unscrewed the cap of the poison vial without shedding a single tear. He told her he had just personally forwarded that exact video, along with Trent's massive cartel money laundering ledger, directly to the highest levels of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He made sure she understood that he was the one who signed her permanent arrest warrant. The split screen ended as Vonda's physical strength completely gave out. The high-definition camera view from her end shook violently as the expensive smartphone slipped from her trembling, sweating fingers. The device clattered onto the carpet. The camera angle shifted to a disorienting, tilted view, looking up toward the curved ceiling of the luxurious cabin. From this skewed perspective, I watched the absolute catastrophic breakdown of the Dubois family matriarch. Vonda's knees buckled entirely. She collapsed heavily onto the floor right beside her dropped phone. She grabbed at her chest, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. She let out a series of ragged, desperate, gasping sounds. The polished woman who had spent years looking down on me was now reduced to a hyperventilating, pathetic mess, crawling on a dirty airplane floor. Jasmine fell to her knees beside her mother, shrieking hysterically, pulling at her own hair in a blind panic. She wailed that she was far too pretty for a federal penitentiary, completely abandoning any pretense of caring about her mother's sudden medical distress. Suddenly, the heavy, chaotic noise of the terrified passengers was cut short by the sharp, authoritative bark of a tactical command. Heavy, synchronized footsteps pounded down the narrow jet bridge and spilled directly into the first-class cabin. A highly trained, heavily armed strike team from the Australian Federal Police surged through the main boarding door. They were wearing dark tactical vests and carrying short-barreled assault rifles. They moved with absolute terrifying precision, immediately locking down the aisles and securing the perimeter of the aircraft. Trent violently pushed himself out of his luxury pod. He completely ignored his gasping mother-in-law and his sobbing wife. His deeply ingrained, arrogant sense of absolute superiority kicked into hyperdrive. He firmly believed his wealth, his expensive tailored suit, and his privileged status as a powerful white American hedge fund manager would somehow act as an invisible, impenetrable shield against foreign law enforcement. He puffed out his chest, completely misreading the severity of the situation, and aggressively stepped into the aisle to confront the advancing tactical team. Trent pointed a shaking but demanding finger directly at the lead Australian officer. He raised his voice, adopting the exact same condescending, entitled tone he used to berate waiters and belittle me at family dinners. He shouted that the officers were making a massive, catastrophic jurisdictional mistake. He aggressively demanded they lower their weapons immediately, insisting they had absolutely no right to board a commercial aircraft to harass an American citizen. He loudly declared his status, bragging about his vast offshore wealth and threatening to have their badges stripped by the end of the day. He demanded an immediate direct phone call to the United States Embassy and threatened to unleash a massive international lawsuit against the entire Australian government for unlawful detention and harassment. The lead officer of the Australian Federal Police did not flinch. He did not offer a polite customer service smile. He was a massive, battle-hardened man who was completely unimpressed by the frantic screaming of a cornered, privileged corporate criminal. The officer stepped forward, closing the distance between them in a single fluid motion. He did not engage in a debate about international law or corporate status. He simply grabbed Trent by the lapels of his incredibly expensive custom shirt, spun him around with brutal practiced efficiency, and slammed him face first against the hard plastic bulkhead of the airplane galley. Trent let out a sharp, pathetic yelp as his face smashed against the wall. The officer forcefully kicked Trent's legs apart, pinning him firmly in place. The cold, heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Trent's wrists echoed sharply over the open FaceTime audio feed. The lead officer leaned in close, his voice a deep, resonant rumble of absolute, inescapable authority. He told Trent to shut his mouth immediately. He coldly stated that his impressive corporate titles meant absolutely nothing on Australian soil. The officer leaned closer to Trent's ear and delivered the exact legal reality that would define the rest of Trent's miserable life. He announced that Mr. Trent was officially under arrest for the orchestration of massive international money laundering on behalf of a heavily sanctioned transnational criminal organization. He confirmed that the execution of this specific arrest warrant was directly coordinated with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and the $50 million in his account had just been seized by the federal government. The heavy silence that followed the officer's declaration shattered into pure, unadulterated chaos. The lead officer signaled to his squad, and two female agents moved swiftly down the narrow aisle toward Jasmine. Jasmine snapped out of her paralyzed shock and began frantically backing away, climbing over the plush leather seating of her luxury first-class pod. She kicked her expensive designer heels at the advancing officers, screaming at the top of her lungs that she was a respectable woman from a prominent Atlanta family. She wailed that her private manicurist was currently waiting for her at a five-star hotel, a pathetic delusional attempt to cling to a privileged reality that no longer existed. The officers were completely unfazed by her hysterical sobbing. They grabbed her wrists, twisted her arms behind her back with practiced non-negotiable force, and secured the heavy steel handcuffs. Jasmine let out a piercing guttural shriek as she was dragged mercilessly down the aisle. Her custom cashmere sweater caught on an armrest and tore apart, unraveling exactly like her manufactured superficial life. In the row ahead, Vonda did not fight the authorities. Her body had completely surrendered to the sheer overwhelming terror of the situation. The realization that her son was fully alive, that the Federal Bureau of Investigation possessed the high-definition video of her poisoning him, and that she was about to die in a harsh foreign prison was far too much for her fragile, hypocritical heart to handle. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed completely flat against the soiled carpet of the airplane floor. A secondary team of airport paramedics immediately rushed the cabin. They did not treat her with the deferential, obsequious respect she always demanded from medical staff back in Atlanta. They moved her with brisk, cold, clinical efficiency. They strapped the disgraced Dubois matriarch onto a rigid transport stretcher, secured an oxygen mask over her face, and wheeled her out of the aircraft under the strict, watchful eyes of two armed federal guards. She looked incredibly small, incredibly frail, and utterly pathetic. Trent watched his mother-in-law being wheeled away, and his basic survival instincts violently kicked in. The legendary arrogance of the Ivy League hedge fund manager instantly evaporated, replaced by the sniveling cowardice of a cornered rat. He began to beg. He desperately tried to throw the very woman who helped him attempt murder directly under the bus. He shouted at the Australian officers that Vonda was the true criminal mastermind. He swore he was just a helpless victim of her intense manipulation. He aggressively insisted that an unknown hacker must have hijacked his offshore accounts, begging the officers to thoroughly check the biometric access logs to prove his total innocence. The lead officer let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He pulled a digital tablet from his tactical vest and shoved the glowing screen directly into Trent's sweaty face. The officer coldly informed him that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already forwarded the preliminary forensic access logs directly to their agency. The system definitively showed that the $50 million transfer was explicitly authorized using Trent's exact unique physical fingerprint and his highly classified retinal scan. The officer explicitly stated that military-grade biometric security simply does not lie. I had executed the digital framing with such terrifying, flawless precision that Trent's own intense paranoia and extreme corporate security measures had become the unshakable steel chains binding him to the crime. There was absolutely zero margin for reasonable doubt. Trent's mouth opened and closed repeatedly, his face draining of all remaining color as he realized he was perfectly, inescapably trapped by his own impenetrable system. The officers forcefully yanked Trent to his feet. They marched him out of the first-class cabin, pushing him roughly through the jet bridge and out into the sprawling, brightly lit terminal of the Sydney International Airport. If a television news camera were broadcasting this live, the lens would be panning rapidly, capturing the raw, visceral humiliation of their absolute, undeniable downfall. Hundreds of international travelers, airport staff, and flight crews stopped dead in their tracks to watch the incredible spectacle unfold. People rapidly pulled out their smartphones, the relentless flashes of digital cameras illuminating Trent's pale, sweating face. He tried to duck his head desperately, attempting to hide behind the broad shoulders of the tactical officers. But there was absolutely nowhere to run. Jasmine was being dragged just a few paces behind him, her expensive makeup smeared completely across her face, still sobbing hysterically about her ruined vacation. Vonda was being wheeled ahead of them, a fallen wicked queen permanently stripped of her stolen kingdom. They were paraded through the massive international arrivals hall, moving steadily toward the heavily guarded exit doors, where armored police transport vans were waiting. As Trent was marched past the designated waiting area for private drivers, his frantic, darting eyes caught sight of something that made the blood in his veins run completely to ice. Standing just outside the designated police perimeter, blending perfectly into the busy morning crowd, was a tight group of 4 men. They were definitely not tourists. They were rugged, heavily muscled men wearing tailored suits that could not hide the thick, intimidating tattoos creeping up their necks and wrists. They were the Australian enforcement branch of the transnational drug syndicate. Trent stumbled hard, his knees violently buckling in sheer, unadulterated terror. The lead enforcer, a towering man with a jagged white scar across his jawline, locked eyes directly with Trent. The man did not shout. He did not pull a concealed weapon. He simply stood there, his hands casually tucked into his trouser pockets, and offered Trent a slow, chilling, utterly terrifying smile. The enforcer slowly raised his right hand, extended his index finger, and made a deliberate, incredibly subtle slicing motion straight across his own throat. Trent let out a strangled, pathetic whimper, desperately trying to pull back against the iron grip of the Australian police. He suddenly began begging the federal officers to protect him, pleading wildly to be placed in permanent solitary confinement, screaming that those men in the crowd were going to butcher him alive. The police officers completely ignored his frantic, nonsensical rambling, violently shoving him forward through the automatic glass doors and throwing him into the dark back of the armored transport van. As the heavy steel doors slammed shut with a deafening thud, sealing Trent in total darkness, the absolute gravity of his new reality finally crushed him. I had not just stripped them of their stolen wealth, their pristine public reputations, and their freedom. I had actively painted a massive glowing target directly on their backs. They were no longer rich, untouchable elites. They were highly valuable, heavily hunted prey, trapped within a foreign prison system, completely at the mercy of the most ruthless criminal syndicate on the entire planet. 6 months later, the suffocating humidity and relentless chaos of that dark underground clinic felt like a lifetime ago. The bright morning sun poured through the massive windows of our Atlanta penthouse, bathing the living room in warm light. I sat comfortably on the exact same velvet armchair where this story began, a steaming cup of dark roast espresso in my hand. The quiet peace in our brand new home was absolute. There were no more frantic heart monitors, no digital countdown timers, and absolutely no arrogant relatives demanding I fetch them coffee while they plotted to steal our future. I took a slow sip, letting the rich flavor ground me in the reality we fought so brutally to secure. Across the room, the television played the international morning news. The anchor maintained a crisp tone as a graphic flashed across the screen. The headline read, "American hedge fund manager and accomplices sentenced in historic transnational money laundering bust." The screen transitioned to footage shot just hours ago outside a heavily fortified courthouse in Sydney, Australia. Trent looked absolutely unrecognizable. His custom-tailored suits had been permanently replaced by a harsh green prison jumpsuit. His trademark arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified stare. He looked incredibly frail, visibly aged by the 6 months he spent waiting for trial, while constantly looking over his shoulder for cartel enforcers. The news anchor smoothly detailed the final verdict. Trent, Vonda, and Jasmine had each been handed 20-year sentences in an Australian maximum security correctional facility, completely without the possibility of early parole. The federal judge had shown zero leniency, explicitly citing the sheer scale of the financial corruption and the attempted murder of an American citizen. The broadcast briefly showed Vonda being escorted from the courtroom. The former highly respected matriarch was shackled at the wrists and ankles, her head bowed in absolute disgrace. Jasmine walked closely behind her, her face hidden behind her tangled hair. They had lost every penny of their wealth, their pristine social standing, and their freedom. They were completely erased from polite society, destined to spend the next 2 decades locked in concrete cells, thousands of miles away from the luxurious lives they felt inherently entitled to. I picked up the remote and clicked the television off, letting the screen fade to black. Their destruction was thoroughly complete, and I did not need to waste another second of my morning dwelling on their miserable existence. Beside me, the heavy leather sofa shifted. Marcus leaned forward, adjusting the cuffs of his immaculate navy blue suit. The lethal poison that nearly stopped his heart was nothing but a dark memory now. His physical recovery had been difficult, but his unwavering determination pushed him through intensive rehabilitation. He was completely healthy, incredibly strong, and operating at the absolute peak of his game. With Trent permanently removed, Marcus had aggressively cleansed his entire tech company. He ruthlessly purged every compromised executive, fortified his financial networks, and rebuilt his enterprise from the ground up. Without Trent siphoning funds, the company experienced an unprecedented surge in market value. Marcus recently secured 3 massive international contracts, making his firm one of the most profitable tech developers in the entire country. He took his company back and he made it an absolute titan of the industry. My own career had experienced a similar meteoric rise. I was no longer an independent auditor fighting for respect in crowded corporate boardrooms. After dismantling a multi-million-dollar transnational money laundering syndicate, my professional reputation became absolutely untouchable. Marcus's board of directors unanimously voted to create a brand new executive position specifically designed for my skill set. I was officially named the Senior Director of Forensic Auditing. I commanded a sprawling department of financial investigators holding absolute authority over the corporation's global financial security. No one ever looked at me and saw a naive girl from South Atlanta anymore. They looked at me and saw the apex predator of the financial sector. The toxic influence of my in-laws had been entirely sanitized from our lives. We sold the old house filled with bitter memories and purchased this gorgeous penthouse high above the city. We surrounded ourselves exclusively with people who valued loyalty, integrity, and genuine respect. The intense, terrifying crucible we survived together had forged an unbreakable bond between Marcus and me. We proved that when tested by absolute fire, we did not break. We became sharp, lethal, and entirely unstoppable. Marcus stood up from the sofa and walked over to my armchair. He looked down at me, his dark eyes radiating profound love and absolute respect. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek black velvet jewelry box. He pressed a small button and the lid popped open. Resting on the dark satin was the flawless antique diamond necklace. It was the exact family heirloom Vonda had desperately tried to use as her emergency escape fund on that doomed flight to Sydney. I had slipped it out of her bag right under her nose, reclaiming the legacy she was entirely unworthy of holding. Marcus gently lifted the heavy glittering diamonds from the protective box. He stepped slowly behind my armchair and carefully draped the cold stones around my neck, fastening the intricate silver clasp securely against my skin. He leaned down, pressing a warm, lingering kiss to my forehead. He whispered softly that the diamonds finally belonged to a woman who possessed the actual strength and fierce intelligence to carry them properly. I reached up, letting my fingers brush lightly against the flawless stones resting on my collarbone. I slowly turned my head, looking directly into the camera lens. I let a cold, satisfied smirk curve the edges of my lips. I leaned forward, delivering my final truth to anyone listening. Never let your in-laws think they can step all over you. especially when you hold the master source code to their entire lives.